So without more ado, let me turn to our first discussant, who's already been introduced, and Dr. Arunachalam Rasapan. Over to you.
Thank you, Colin. Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's actually afternoon already now. I'm actually very happy to be here today and also tomorrow to not only be a discussant but also to share with you some experiences from other countries. I'm actually also amazed to see the crowd this morning. Really. When we first started with this evaluation thing sometime back in '99, when the groups met in Barbados, we only had a handful of groups, country-based groups, and evaluation was not really such a big agenda. But now we see there are 100 over entities all over the place, and evaluation has become such a big agenda. That brings me to the first point that the speakers made earlier on, and particularly Rolly Tumpalan's presentation on the policy. I have a lot of points to discuss here, but I want to go back to basics. The first question that I think we should all ask ourselves is, when in the public sector, let me go back to my experience. I joined the civil service in 1974, and we were put through 6 months of intensive preparation, including diplomacy, how to read the financial statement, and so on and so forth. But there wasn't one subject or one topic on monitoring and evaluation in 6 months of intensive preparation as a civil servant. That speaks volumes. So my question to us is this: even now, and I'm sure in the Philippines, in most other countries, we have civil servants when they enter the civil service. They go through some kind of training, I'm sure, 3 months, 6 months, whatever. We call it internship and so on and so forth. Is monitoring and evaluation a subject that's being taught for civil servants coming into the civil service? The second question is this: when we do an assessment of the situation monitoring evaluation, we look at a lot of things, whether there is a policy in place, and I think that's very important, whether there is a policy, otherwise there's no agenda, people don't pay attention. But more so that is monitoring and evaluation, first of all, recognized as a critical performance management tool? And if it is recognized, how is it being treated? How is it being approached? So the question is this: very often we say in the civil service you're very fashion conscious. Every day or every month or every year we change the way we do things. One day is ISO, another day is TQM, another day is whatever, Blue Ocean, RBM. So next year I don't know what's coming up. We have to invent something new. So, but why are we not looking at the substantive issues? Why are we not training civil servants in substantive issues? Why is monitoring and evaluation only now being considered? Why are we not making sure that every civil servant, when they get employed in the civil service, they are at least, they don't have to come in with the knowledge, fine. But why are we not treating this as one of the most important factors for performance management in government? That's a question I can't answer because I don't know. Even we have failed back home, and many countries we don't address it. The third aspect is this: now that we are talking so much about the importance, and I have no argument about that. I perfectly agree with all those issues and points we've made at the policy level right down to the implementation level, including impact evaluation. But my point is this: even in the universities, for long-term foundation in the universities, what are we teaching our future civil servants? What do they come into the civil service with? Do they know how to read a financial statement? Is that the most important? Do they learn about strategic management? PDCA, whatever, there are a lot of acronyms out there. But I don't see evaluation as part of that. Even if we learn about strategic management, project management, and so on and so forth, we always put, or we focus actually on monitoring rather than evaluation. And I think Rolly made a good point just now. that we very often tend to focus more on the monitoring and evaluation, that's correct. And very often, again, you look at the diagrams and charts and logic diagrams and so on. Evaluation always appears at the end. Again, a big question mark. Who says that evaluation is only at the end? Why are we even not looking at things like what we call design evaluation? It means, how do you make sure that your public sector programs and projects are even addressing the right problems in the first place? In social science, we call it type 3 error. Type 3 error means you're addressing the wrong problem but doing it very nicely. Fantastic. Like the operation which was very successful, but the person died after that because you were addressing the wrong problem in the first place. Okay, I have another issue that I would like for you to think about, to reflect about. How many of you have flown a plane? No, not flown a plane, flown in a plane. Most of you have flown, right? Do you know how the pilot, what kind of evaluation that the pilot does? Does he do evaluation after 1 year? Does the pilot do an evaluation after 5 years, summative evaluation? Think about it. How often does this pilot carry out an evaluation when he or she is flying a plane? Every flight, there's a pre, during, and post. Ex, ante, right? And during and ex post. Do you agree with that? You all agree with that because, why? Your lives are at stake. But when it comes to the poor farmer, the children, whatever, take a figure, and we start debating about evaluation, we say, oh, we must do, what do you call it, summative evaluation. And we come out with a magic number like, oh, what's a good number? 5. Okay, every 5 years you must do an evaluation. The fact that a child is being poorly educated for 5 years, God help them. The farmer suffers for 5 years before you do your wonderful ex post or summative evaluation to correct a program. That's not important. Why? If you go for surgery in the hospital, how often do you think the surgeon who is operating on you should do an evaluation? After 5 years? After 1 year? Again, you insist that a surgeon should do evaluation immediately, before, and even after, even before and not only after, even before. What percent of mistakes, or what shall I say, errors and mistakes would you tolerate for a surgeon? 0. It's interesting. 0%. But when it comes to the student whose education programs you are designing, you don't care about it. Do you actually do an evaluation every year? Okay, these are questions, I'm just asking some fundamental questions, back to basics, right? Because I don't think we want to get distracted by a lot of other issues, federalism, what you call it, federalism and things like that. And then going and doing things which are insignificant or not really hitting the target the first time. Give you an example. In a country, and I don't need to name which country, they have approached monitoring evaluation very nicely. They put it into the constitution. The constitution says that you must do mandatory evaluation. Sorry, monitoring and evaluation. But after now almost 8 years, it's still not very successful. Why? Because the base is not there. There's no system there. They don't even know how to apply it, what to apply it on. Of course, they agree that monetary evaluation is important. So again, it goes back to, going back to basics. Let's look at what we're doing in public sector. It's not just coming out of policy, coming out making sure the budget is well spent or the people are being productive. The fundamental is this: we in government have or are being there for a purpose. It is to bring about a change to the quality of life of people. We are addressing the needs and problems, substantive needs and problems, and that's why we come out with public policy. So how are we doing this? And why are we not using evaluation to go back to basics in terms of asking even why, what are we doing, and why are we doing these things? Are they making an impact? Why are we not doing this on a daily basis? So I think the issue goes back to the issue of, and I know today we didn't really talk a little bit about formative, the different types of evaluation. I want to go back to the issue of formative and summative evaluation. These are just jargons. But the process is this, that when we are doing an intervention program in government, whether it's a high-level policy program or a project like what we just said about the last speaker, how do you intend to use evaluation as part of the integral part of the process? That means you are going to plan for evaluation right from the beginning, that means the planning stage itself of the project. You're going to apply evaluation right through, not at the end, not in the middle, right through from beginning, formulation, right through to implementation. Is a complete loop. So the question to us again, ladies and gentlemen, I will not go into the other details. Let's go back to basics. Let's ask ourselves some fundamental questions. Do we need to address all of these things, and then how best to do it? Obviously, there's a starting point. We need now, we are conscious about these. We are starting to come out with policies. We are coming out with new strategies, incentives, and so on and so forth. But talking about incentives, I was quite taken up by what Laura said just now. She was talking about incentivizing people to perform. That was reminding me about another issue that we debated about several years ago. Where is the base for civil servants when we want to incentivize them? When you hire a person to do a job, are you expecting the person to perform poorly, so therefore you must give a bonus to make sure the person performs? Or is it the other way around? That when you hire a person, the minimum expected standards of performance and productivity and whatever is expected, and that's why you're paying the person a salary and allowance and so on and so forth. And if they excel above that baseline, then you incentivize, you a bonus or whatever, other kinds of incentives. So that's a very important question, because otherwise we have pushed the baseline very low. And the starting point is already wrong. And we debated about it so much, and of course there are a lot of our pros and cons, big arguments about this. So I think we need to look at some of those issues. One other point that I have across the board, I think, on all the presentation is that a lot of these things we're doing is fantastic. We've moved a long way, I think, in terms of making progress. But we need to watch out for this. That, and even in Malaysia, we are guilty of this. We say a lot of things. In my language, we have something like, and in English, we have it that we don't walk the talk. We say a lot of things, very nice, conceptual things. On paper, it looks very nice, but we don't actually do it. Or we do it in different ways. We don't follow what we are saying. So we need to watch out for things like, a lot of indicators are there, but indicators are very easy. You can focus on indicators which are output based, and you can achieve it. You can focus on indicators which are input based, you can achieve it. And then we are saying we are doing very well. But that's not the case. The acid test is always this. Did our programs bring about a change, a substantive change, to the problems and needs that we are asking to address through the program in the first place? That is the acid test. All those other numbers that we are playing around with, the ratings and rankings, and I tell you, we have these things. I was very thrilled by the numbers which were shown just now in the local government performance system. Because we went through the same thing, and we have all this what we call a star rating, beautiful stars, different colors and so on and so forth. But I tell you, literally, they're meaningless because everybody is playing the game. What we call gaming in civil service. People are very smart at playing games. And they use numbers to fudge and all kinds of things. So I'm not sure whether you have the same challenges, but we have it. And it's a difficult situation. Yeah? Okay, so thank you very much for that, and I'll pass it back to...
Thank you very much, Dr. Satnanda Anui, who we are next discussing. Thank you.
I recall during my younger days, I also did on-the-spot evaluation. I gave spot quizzes to my young staff, but without their names included in the feedback sheet. But my attention was called, and they said it was ethically incorrect. So I had to stop it. Because I was, at that time, I was feeling insecure about the dissemination and absorption. information and knowledge that is coming from the leadership of NEDA. So this is my set of comments on the 4 presentations. Next. So we had 4 presentations. I'm not going to comment on the last one because that was the paper prepared beforehand. So we have the 4 presentations done by Rolly on the National Evaluation Policy Framework, DBM, on results-based budgeting, DILG, on GPMS with the lens of decentralization, and the preliminary findings of the evaluation of this. What are the strong points of the 4 papers taken together? They include the following. Number 1, of course, this is the context in which they are being presented. There is at the present time a high public trust rating of the President. And I think this is being maximized, particularly by NEDA and DBM, to promote a culture of monitoring and evaluation. And indeed, it supports the commitment to reforms in this particular field. And then we all appreciate the value of the results chain. And in the context of the evaluation framework, it has both horizontal and vertical links. In other words, you deal with the entire bureaucracy at various levels and their vertical relationships. And it is covered the areas of planning, budgeting, and implementation, and finally M&E. Then, of course, there's already an acceptance of the value of good governance, particularly as exhibited in the GPMS presentation, and which is further strengthened by what I call the Robredo and other similar reforms. And I think everybody here knows what the late Secretary has done. And unexpectedly, and I think this is a good development, I've seen the numbers in terms of a large number of local government compliers, both in the data that was presented by DILG and the recent social weather station survey of the perception of the public on local governance. And then, of course, this is a message to NEDA. GPMS could be a leading bottom-up vehicle for the national regional NDF process. And of course, we all value the importance of inclusion in prosperity, and inclusion in the distribution of growth. So what are the uncited and perhaps less developed topics? And they include the following. Number 1, I haven't heard in the presentation the role of government corporations. If you look at the asset of the public sector, I believe that the government corporations even have a bigger asset taken together than local governments. That's in the DBM website, which can be validated. And of course, the important role of COA, especially in the context of auditing. And we have seen this illustrated, for instance, in the DILG seal of good housekeeping, where there is a criteria with respect to COA findings. If there is an adverse COA finding, then you are automatically removed from the list. Then, of course, I was hoping that at the start of this presentation, we'll get some insights from the new Director General of NEDA, who is a poverty reduction analytical expert. And I was somewhat disappointed that he did not come at the start, but I was informed by Rolly that he might be our closing remarks speaker. And it will be good to get some perspective from him on how he intends to develop an inclusive development framework, including M&E framework, in the review of the PDE, of the PDP. And of course, we have seen some improvements in the inclusive process, which involve the integration of MDGs and the conduct of social and bottom-up budgeting. In fact, last night there was a 30-minute discussion on ANC, on local budgeting. And then, of course, the importance of having an inclusive growth evaluation model, and I already cited this, and then integrating inclusion in all projects, not just the 4 Ps. And then just on advocacy in the context of the United Nations, we have the human rights-based approach to planning and policy, many elements of which exist in the presentations, although some are still largely untapped. And I would like to emphasize the importance of capacity assessment of duty bearers. The words institutional capacity review and review of individual duty bearers as well. Then, of course, we have gotten some insights with respect to integrating the RR, and I think we need to add integrating peace and vertical equity. Vertical equity meaning the distribution of opportunities and income among various social groups, not individuals, as provided in the concept of horizontal equity. On the first presentation, the framework is demanded by the existing results matrices found in the PDP. It's comprehensive and integrated, but somewhat ambitious, although it can be streamlined, simplified, and progressively implemented. The challenges, of course, include cascading the system at all levels, fostering coherence and coordination, and maintaining optimism, compliance, and sustainability. Next. Then on the second presentation, results-based budgeting, there was no mention of the zero-based budgeting approach, which requires creating synergy in tradition, inertia, and reforms. And of course, we have participatory bottom-up budgeting. In the program last night, the public was informed that 595 full LGUs have participated in the formulation of local poverty action plans, which are inputs to both local and national budgeting. Then the point of being raised with respect to incentivizing local government units, being sure that the bar does not reflect mediocrity at a higher level of performance. In the presentation of the ILG, the incentivization deals mainly with national and local government cooperation. Yet, in the context of the local government code, it also promotes intra and inter-LGU cooperative undertakings, and not much has been said about that. Then, of course, the importance of including agency absorptive capacity as a leading M&E concern. For instance, this year, it's likely that the government will have a small budget surplus, and this is for the most part a product of underspending, although there have been some remarkable increases so far, thus far, and this will help address the recurrent issue of the Philippines having a very small investment to GDP ratio of 3%, although the standard is perhaps 5%. In other countries in Asia, it can go up to 7 to 8%. The use of the PPP mode in developing small public sector projects. The ILG progressive evaluation of the GPMS, this is a testimony to the persistent and institutional commitment of the ILG. And GPMS has been developed for, I believe, more than a decade. And it is still alive and developing. And of course, I already said that we need to sustain progressive reforms. And then the next agenda would include maximizing constituents' proximity to and satisfaction with city municipal governance. This is what the SWS survey say based on my reading, which may not necessarily be consistent with what was presented by Director Acosta. And in that survey, it also says that there is a high awareness of local projects to Mindanao. And I think this says a lot about government initiatives to provide more assistance to this area. And at the same time, highlights the importance of having sufficient and capable civil society organizations and other non-state players in promoting governance, especially at the subnational level. Then, of course, the LGPMS has to integrate other indicators which are found in other sector performance systems, such as nutrition, public health, and under the child-friendly local government system of CWC. And of course, explaining results and taking actions on gaps. The SWD, I'm not going to deal on the methodology, but let me just highlight the following. Number one, it's important to include in any evaluation other unmeasured benefits and the attendant costs as well, such as the local economic effects, especially in small barangays where there is a large pool of recipients, confidence building among individuals. We hope that the program develops and the long-term development of social capital. And I wish this can be included in the next round of evaluation. The program has rapidly expanded, and even more if the sin tax bill is approved, which will provide additional funding, including that of universal health coverage. And then we hear plans on the part of the SWD to include the street poor and other unreached indigenous families. And this, of course, calls for a well-defined exit and transition strategy. What happens after 2014 or after the last batch has ended? And to the extent that poverty has not yet been completely eradicated at that time, and then that's going to be the problem of the next government. Then, of course, there is a recognition of the persistent issue of local government ownership as measured by supply side gaps, and then the need for equal attention to the role of fathers. Believe it or not, in the certificate, although that this might have changed doors, the father is not a signatory. The signatory of the 40 agreement is only the SWD and the mother. The father is not included. So you can be sure that there is a gender blindness there. I'm not even saying responsiveness. That was the biggest surprise to me. And then, of course, the need to evaluate purpose in the context of companion and related programs, such as the Comprehensive Employment Management Program. We talk of inclusive growth, and employment is very important. And the last labor force survey indicates that while unemployment is 7%, and underemployment has risen to 23%. As high as the unemployment rate of the state, although that's another story. Then you have the recurrent issues of determining or comparing actual situation with the counterfactual. In other words, what would have happened if the program did not exist? Or the opportunity cost of the program. What would have been the impact if the 14 billion budget for PORPIS, or as envisioned, were allocated for similar poverty alleviation programs? Of course, that's an academic question, but it is very important for purposes of defining public policy. So, a few final suggestions. Take a brief pause to consolidate and simplify reforms. I think LEDA and DBM have been working too hard. And we need to see to it that capacities need to match plan processes and results. I know that the unfolding or the laying out of the system incorporates capacity building. But I think capacity is not probably able to catch up with the enormity of expectations, data, processes, standards that is envisioned. Then, of course, we need to integrate more effective and realistic and inclusive M&T processes and methodologies. This is something that I had really wanted to hear from Secretary Balisacan, and the new director of the National Planning Policy Staff, who are both experts in doing poverty evaluation. So beyond methodology, what are the processes that they envision for the purpose of improving the process at which PDP is being formulated? Then we need to implement the National Evaluation Framework beyond the executive department. And that is by emphasizing the value of MNT in the political process. I'm sure that there are elements that are already embodied in the agenda and activities or programs of congressional oversight and appropriations committees. And in fact, this raises the second question there. Should elements of the National Evaluation Framework, results-based budgeting, and GPMS be legislated? I remember during the later days of the administration of the previous president, there was some discussion as to whether we need a law to implement 4Ps, to get sustainability in a legislative way. And then, of course, the last point is we need to plant the seeds of sustainability when conditions are very, very favorable. And we need to do that not later than 2016. And we have 2 years to go. Thank you.
Kindly elaborate briefly on the timelines and activities of the evaluation policy drafting process and how development partners can contribute. So I think that's an offer to participate in the evaluation policy drafting process. I've got 1 or 2 more. Let me give you them all, and then you can come back. Second one is what is NEDA's good practice benchmark in preparing the national evaluation policy for the Philippines? So what comparisons are you taking into account? Thirdly, and last, you'll be pleased to hear, what is the perspective of NEDA and the Department of Budget Management as regards the application of the performance management system to the private sector and civil society organizations? Sorry, this is really more about the performance management side, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But Mr. Tungpalan, if you want to respond to the questions that have been posed. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Elaborate briefly is a difficult combination of words. I wonder how one can elaborate briefly. But surely, I mentioned about the timelines. I said we have an opportunity with the updated plan to launch an evaluation policy. At the time, we would have the updated plan. And I think it's a good timing. Although Willie Nugui mentioned about before May 2016, I think the generosity of Willie, I guess his knowledge about how the bureaucracy works, says if we have something good to deliver by 2016, that should be well. But our fighting target, at least the MNE network, we're looking at before June 2018. When the President launches the updated plan, it should even hone neatly the performance measurements that have to be put in place, the meaningful targets, notwithstanding the esotericity of the multitude of indicators that are found in the RM. The second question, what do we consider good practice among evaluation policies? It would be very presumptuous on our part to say that is good practice, this is good practice. What we are doing now really is to do a search of what are the practices, even with the knowledge that Colin mentioned today, that countries are actually updating, reviewing the evaluation policy. So in a very dynamic world, the Philippines will have to rely on its indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices, as well as its good sense of where we want the Philippines and the instruments to deliver to there. So it's not easy for us to cite a good practice institution, a good practice country, but we are in search. For those of you who can volunteer what are the good practices that we might have missed out in our research for good practices, whether it's the US, UK, Malaysia, please don't be shy in contributing to that wealth of review of literature or wealth of review of good practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move on quickly then, and we have quite a few questions on the results-based performance management system. So I think these are directed towards the Undersecretary, Laura Pasqua. And the first one that we have is what policy mechanisms have been established to control the occurrence of performance paradoxes? I think we've heard a little bit about some of the performance paradoxes in the discussion. How do we control the occurrence of performance paradoxes in the course of implementing the results-based performance management system? There are several more questions. Let me just give them to you all at once. The next question is, what is the perspective of the Department of Budget Management as regards the application of the results-based performance management system to the private sector and civil society organizations, in other words, outside government? Two more questions. This is very specific. It's slide number 9 on the MFO accountability report card, that's MERC1. It seems that the DOLE, sorry for the acronyms, everybody, I hope you know what they are, is doing an overall results assessment using performance indicators for the outputs. Is this MFO accountability assessment a results-based exercise? Good question, interesting question. And then in slide 10, Priority Program Accountability Report Card, the PPARC. Does the DOLE conduct an overall results assessment by using only one indicator of performance for a priority program? Maybe that should be reconsidered. So there we are. Those are all the questions on the performance system, on the performance management system. Over to you.
On the first question about how do we prevent the paradoxes or the performance paradoxes? Well, under this, for this year, and I think this will be a basic principle, we are really allowing the department secretaries to have flexibility in the implementation of the performance-based bonus. So we are giving the heads of agencies flexibility in identifying the delivery units to enroll in the system, and number 2, the performance indicators to use for the system. Although we are setting the criteria that one, the targets must be higher than 2011, and number 2, it cannot only contain quantity targets, but also quality and timeliness indicators too, so that we move the system along to thinking about impacts rather than just quantities of outputs. Now, we will be doing some validation of the accomplishments in December, and I think during the first quarter. And we will be involving the private sector and the civil society organization into this exercise. The third question is DOLE. DOLE, I think, is one of the departments that is really into resource management, using concepts of outputs already. Is there somebody from DOLE here to validate? Because a long time ago, when they started using the OPIF, then they were already into using the system for the allocation of resources. So that is what we are trying to embed in the agencies, not only looking at the financial or the status of the fund utilization, but also the status of their outputs and the programs, to be able to manage their budgets and their the progress of their programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move on now to the third set of questions, which are focused on local government and the presentation by Mr. Rolando Acosta. So we've got a number of questions here also. Let me pose the first question then. What are the bases or indicators used for classifying province and cities with a poor state of development? So a desire there to understand what the indicators are which indicate poor state of development. Let me give all the questions at once. The second question then is specific to Valenzuela City, which is considered as a consistent top performer in the period 2009 to 2011, and yet it seems to have been considered as a city with a poor state of development. So there seems to be a contradiction in the evidence there. So clarification on that would be very welcome. And the third and last question is about the status of sharing the data with the collective body of governors, cities and municipalities. So how is the data being shared and taken up by the local bodies? So if I can call on Mr. Acosta to respond. Is he here? He's left already. Would anyone else like to address those questions from? Do we have anyone else from DILG who can pick up the questions? They were obviously expecting tough questions at DILG. Do we have someone who can respond? Tough questions. I'm sure we can send the questions on to Mr. Acosta. Now we have quite a stack of questions about the 4Ps program and the impact evaluation that was conducted. Not very easy to separate the substantive issues from the methodological issues. So I'm just wondering if we have both of our presenters still with us. Mr. Chowdhury's gone, so on the methodology we may not have too many answers. Okay. So anyway, let me give the questions out, and if anyone's able to answer on the methodology side, that would be very welcome. So the first question is the CCT program only 2.5 years in duration? If it is only 2.5 years in duration when the study was done, how confident are we that the impacts being measured really are impacts? And the comment is, in the development evaluation field, the tacitly acknowledged period for a program to have impacts, in other words, medium to long-term results, is 3.5 years. So is it too early to attempt to measure results? Interesting question. Let me ask all the questions at once. Here's a question about how we use the evaluation. How do we address the requirements of conducting a rigorous evaluation versus program implementation realities and public policy constraints? So it's a bit of a real-world question there, I think, about how we position rigorous evaluation in the face of constraints. Here's a question about monitoring rather than evaluation. The question here is whether the organization is also monitoring participating families in the CCT, the Conditional Cash Transfer Program, including those who have graduated from the program and hopefully out of poverty. So a question of whether there's monitoring and follow-up of the participating households. Let me throw them all out at once and then see if you can pick up the questions. On impact evaluation methods, what's the rationale of doing a separate survey instead of using existing data already available from household surveys and so on? And a slightly different question, what about building capacities in the ministry's offices to build an M&E system for the cash transfer program? So what are we doing about building capacity for M&E? And the last question, sorry to give you so many at once, has the program noted the influence or linkage in its positive impact with the fertility rate of married women? And if yes, what does the link look like? What is the linkage? So an interesting question about some of the other effects, perhaps, that may or may not have been measured by the evaluation. So can I call upon our presenter to respond to some of these tough questions? Thank you.
Oh my, we're given lots of questions here. Okay. And then I was asking why is it throwing all these questions at once? when the other resource person has already left. Anyway, on the first one, do we have enough confidence that the result of the first wave of impact evaluation after 2.5 years of exposure is enough? Actually, just to give you a background on the IE, impact evaluation, we initially intended that after 1 year of exposure, we would do the first wave. But because of some administrative difficulties in procuring or doing procurement for the impact evaluation, we actually delayed the actual data gathering to after 2.5 years of program exposure. Whether that, in effect, benefited the result of the impact evaluation, we don't really know for sure. But what we're saying is we're trying to get a snapshot of the current effects of the program on the beneficiaries. We needed that to make sure that we are on track in terms of achieving our goals, because this is a 5-year program, and at first we didn't know if there would be enough government commitment to continue with the rollout of the program. So we need to embed that from the very beginning. So as designed, we're supposed to do an annual basis, but when we revised the impact evaluation design, so we did the first data gathering in 2.5 years after the program implementation, but it will be followed by the second wave come 2013, later part of 2013, and then the last wave will be on 2015. So that's how we plan to do the impact evaluation. And I think, and I believe that the methodology, the design of the program, of the impact evaluation is really useful for us to have that much confidence in the results of the impact evaluation. Otherwise, we cannot wait until after the program is completed by 2018 for us to get the results of this program. And then on the second part, if I captured correctly, I think how do we balance the need for doing a rigorous impact evaluation in the face of public policy choices. I think this would most resound to us in terms of when we first designed the IE, the impact evaluation, we were only thinking of the first set of beneficiaries back then, because we didn't know if we're even going to roll out massively. So we designed the randomized control trial and the regression discontinuity batch of beneficiaries, totaling more than 300,000 households. So back then, we were still able to randomly select those that will be treated and those that will be assigned as controlled households. But immediately after that, because of the global financial crisis in 2008, the government decided to massively expand the program, and therefore that already limited us in terms of doing further RCPs. And that also limited us in terms of the results of the impact evaluation, because that can only hold true for the first batch of beneficiaries. So that's how the public policy, the government's decision to massively expand, impacted on how we designed the IE. So what happened is that we redesigned the impact evaluation so that in the second and third grades, we will ensure that there is national, the sample of the IE will be nationally representative, so that we can speak for the impact of the whole program nationwide, rather than just for any particular batch of beneficiaries. And then we also, we can no longer do our RCP, therefore we just contented with the RDB up until the third grade, but we're going to maintain the RCP sample, the households, up until the third grade, just to make sure that we will have this spanning data. We'll be able to do a longitudinal study. So that's how the public policy affected the demand for us to do a rigorous impact evaluation. And then the third question is, do we monitor the beneficiaries that have graduated from the program? Right now, we still do not have graduates from the program. Our earliest enrollees in the program will graduate by end of 2013. So we're already setting in motion a lot of activities, a lot of interventions to make sure that even before they leave the program, after they hit the 5-year mark, they'll be able to at least be accessed to necessary support interventions so that all the gains from the program will not be put to waste. So, but after that, we intend to keep longer our municipal links, our field staff, to make sure that there will be monitoring of these household beneficiaries after they graduate by December 2013, because our field staff will be responsible for ensuring that there is advocacy at the local level so that the needed support by the beneficiaries will be integrated in the local development plans of the local government units. On the fourth question, why did we not use existing census information? This is the question. The census information done by the does not have names, does not have specific addresses. They're only numbers. So we had to rely on our own survey, because our surveys clearly identify who these households are and where they are. So we cannot rely on the data from the NSC or the NSC. And then, do we have plans? It's the question, do we have plans for continuing capacity building on MNE? Yes, we do. As far back as 2006, when the Department of Social Welfare and Development started to implement its reform program, we have identified back then that MNE is really one of our water use. So what we did is to make this part of our reform agenda, and there's this continuing effort to really build capacity, not only of MNE per project, but MNE as a department-wide MNE. And I think this will continue on, and we're getting a lot of support from our development partners, either through the existing loan agreements or through technical assistance. And we're also going into a lot of partnerships with the academy and some other organizations that will help us build our internal capacity on MNE. And the last point, I think, is the program encouraging increased fertility among women. Is that question?
Is it a positive impact on fertility?
By positive, do we mean are we reducing fertility? I think in the context of the Philippines, that's the intention, really, not to reduce fertility of women by saying positive. We did not explicitly be indicated in any of our program documents. But we have this silent intention that the program would discourage further fertility among women, among poor households. And as part of the program design, we did this by ensuring that we only provide educational support, additional educational support to a maximum only of 3 children per household. And then if there are new pregnancies in the household, we only record and monitor them for monitoring purposes, and that feeds into the compliance for health, but that does not have any bearing on additional health grants, because the health grant is like all or nothing grant. Comply with all applicable health conditions or you get nothing. So even if there are new pregnancies in the households, if the pregnant woman does not submit herself to the health center for the prenatal care, or after that the postnatal, then she gets nothing for the health grant. But that does not have any bearing on the education grant. So that's how the program is trying to silently discourage greater fertility among poor women.
Great, thank you very much. And can I ask for a round of applause for our discussion? Thank you very much. I've just received some news about the situation on the other side of the Pacific. I better announce this in a very neutral way, but you can tell by my smile that President Obama has retained the presidency. I don't know what the details are. And there was no evaluation as far as I know. Maybe that follows. It's really lunchtime. In fact, it is lunchtime. So I don't want to do a big summing up of the really very rich discussions, but it's been an exceptional morning, I think. We've covered so much from evaluation of policy issues to the evaluation of a particular program, and a very good evaluation, it would seem, of a very particular and specific program. And I think this has allowed us to ask all sorts of questions along the way and inform ourselves of all sorts of progress that is being made. Coming to the Philippines as an outsider, I'm hugely impressed by the seriousness and the energy and the momentum that seems to be there behind the reforms. But I noticed also that, particularly from Mr. Nukui, that there's also a little note of caution. You know, are these real changes? Are they really happening? What will we see follow through in terms of sustainability in time to come? And also some questions about capacity. Are we running ahead faster than our feet can take us? And I think that point was raised by our other discussant, Dr. Rasapan. But I think on the whole, as I say, too much to wrap up in one particular moment, but really a wonderful feast for all of us involved with M&E activities. And I was very much brought up short by the suggestion that there were type 3 problems. Maybe we're addressing the wrong problems, but addressing them in a very elegant way. Well, I don't think that's the case this morning. I think we've been addressing the right problems, and the paper givers did indeed address them in an elegant fashion. I'm keen to finish with the 3 R's, I think it might even be 4 R's, that were raised by the Deputy Secretary General. Are we spending resources on the right things? Are we doing things right? And are we achieving sustainable results? I think if we keep those simple questions in our mind, even while we're thinking about the complexities of scorecards and the difficulties of randomized controlled trials, we'll stay on the right track. So thank you all very much for your participation this morning. Enjoy lunch, and I look forward to further discussions in the afternoon. Thank you.